The last ember died just after midnight. Willa Hale watched it go, the way you watched something inevitable without surprise, without the energy left for surprise. One moment there was a small orange pulse in the fire pit, the size of a thumbnail, fragile as a held breath. The next moment there was nothing, just gray ash, and the particular cold that followed the death of fire. In an enclosed space, a cold that moved inward immediately, purposefully, as if it had been waiting just outside for exactly this moment. She was 62 years old. She had survived 35 Montana winters. She knew cold the way you knew the face of someone you had lived beside for decades. Every expression, every mood, every version of its cruelty. This cold was different. This cold had the quality of a final thing. Beside her, Ruth was a still shape wrapped in every blanket and scrap of cloth they owned. 82 years had carved deep lines into Ruth's face, but the cold was doing something else to those lines, now smoothing them in a way that was not peaceful, filling them in with a waxen stillness that Willa could not look at directly. She could feel Ruth's hand in hers. The hand was cold, but the faintest tremor moved through it at intervals irregular as a candle flame in a draft. Still there. Still holding. At their feet, Jasper was not sleeping. He had not slept in hours. The German shepherd was a dense coil of muscle and attention, his fur standing slightly along his spine in a way that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with some knowledge he carried that Willa did not yet possess. He rose and paced the 3 steps the lean-to allowed. He pressed his cold nose into Willa's hand, his golden eyes finding hers in the darkness with an urgency that she felt before she understood it. He would settle for a moment, then rise again. His disquiet was not random. It had the quality of something deliberate, a message being delivered in a language she had not yet learned to read. The blizzard outside was not a weather event. It was the entire world. The wind had found every gap in the rough-hewn timbers of the lean-to, every place where 2 boards did not meet cleanly, every breath of space between log and log, and it pressed through all of them with equal, implacable force. The structure was less a shelter than a prayer that had been answered adequately for 2 nights, and was now on this 3rd night no longer sufficient. Her breath came out white. She watched it feather in the air and disappear the way everything disappeared in this country, when the conditions were wrong, the way tracks disappeared, the way voices disappeared, the way men disappeared, the way Thomas had disappeared. She had not let herself think his name for 3 days, not because she did not love him. She had loved him for 35 years. With the specific layered love that accumulates between 2 people who have built something together, something real, something that required both of them to stand. She had not thought his name because thinking it opened a door she could not afford to have open when everything else required her complete attention, when the mule still lived, when the fire still burned, when the distance still felt possible. Now the fire was gone, and the mule was gone, and the distance felt like a joke that the mountain had been telling all along, and the cold was pressing inward, and there was nowhere left to put the grief, except directly in front of her, where it had been waiting the whole time. Thomas. She said it in her mind and felt the shape of it, the weight of it, the way it changed the temperature of whatever air it moved through. Thomas Hale. 43 years old when she met him, already building, already certain, already the man he was going to be. He had been a man made of sunshine and sawdust, she used to think. His laughter had been a constant warmth in whatever room he occupied. He had built their cabin with his own hands over the course of a single summer. Each log fitted with care, each joint cut true as if he believed that a well-made thing lasted and a lasting thing mattered. He had been certain of the future in a way that some people were not, naively not, without awareness of what the land demanded, but with a foundational belief that effort and love and honest work were enough. He had been wrong about one thing. She had not known he was wrong until a man named Harlan Voss rode up the lane one week after the funeral, with a leather folio under his arm and a horse too well fed for the mountains. But that was later. First, there was the fever. It came in September, which was not an unusual time for illness in the valley. The end of summer and the beginning of the cold season, when the body did not always know how to make the transition. When the lungs remembered summer air and found fall air too sharp. When the blood moved slower than it should. Thomas had been tired for a week before the fever began. The kind of tired that a man who worked hard recognized as something other than fatigue. A tiredness that lived in the bones rather than the muscles. He had said nothing about it. He had not been a man who spoke about what his body was doing when there was still work left undone. On a Tuesday, he sat down in the middle of cutting firewood and did not get up. Willa had found him there in the yard, the axe in the grass beside him, his face a color she had never seen on him before. She had gotten him inside. She had sent word to the doctor in the next valley by way of a passing rider. She had done everything that could be done, which was not enough, and which she had known as she was doing it was not enough. The knowing sitting in her chest like a stone from the first hour. He was gone by Friday. 3 days. A fever that moved fast and did not negotiate. The doctor arrived on Saturday, which was a full day too late, and he stood in the cabin doorway with his hat in his hands and said the things that doctors said, the words that were true and meaningless at the same time, words about how quickly these things sometimes moved about, how there was nothing that could have been done differently. Willa had nodded. She had thanked him. She had closed the door after he left and stood in the kitchen for a long time, not moving, not crying yet, only understanding in her body before her mind would accept it, that the shape of every remaining day had just been permanently altered. Ruth had come from the small room off the kitchen where she slept, the room that had been Thomas's mother's room since the year Willa and Thomas were married, and Ruth had come to live with them as an old woman who was not yet old enough to stop being useful. Ruth had come and stood beside Willa without speaking. The two women had stood together in the kitchen Thomas built, and the silence between them had been the loudest thing in the valley. The week after the funeral had a quality that Willa would never be able to adequately describe, a kind of stretched time days that were too long and too short. Simultaneously, hours that moved through her rather than around her. She had fed the animals. She had done what needed doing. She had slept in the bed she had shared with Thomas for 35 years, on her side of it, which she had kept to out of habit rather than grief, though the grief was there, enormous and patient, waiting for her to be still long enough to feel it fully. Silas Pruitt came by on Thursday to help with the wood that Thomas had been cutting when he sat down. He was a practical man, Silas 58 years old, with a face that had been shaped by every hard thing this valley offered, and a manner that was direct without being unkind. He stacked wood for 3 hours and drank coffee with Willa at the kitchen table, and said nothing about the future, which she appreciated. He was one of those people who understood that sometimes the kindest thing you could do was perform a useful function and ask nothing in return. It was the following Monday that Voss came. She heard the horse before she saw the man. A well-shod horse on the mountain road had a particular sound, the clean strike of iron against stone. and this one had the unhurried gait of an animal that was not tired, that had not been pushed. Willa was on the porch when the rider came around the bend in the lane, and she registered several things at once. The quality of his coat, which had never been dirty, the leather folio under one arm, and the particular expression on his face, which was not unkind, and was therefore more alarming than cruelty would have been. Harlan Voss was 52 years old, a man of ledgers and law, his face a mask of polite and unyielding arithmetic. He dismounted with the ease of a man who had done this many times, who had arrived at many properties with many folios, who had learned how to hold his body in a way that communicated neither threat nor guilt, but only inevitability. He introduced himself. He expressed condolences that were genuine in the way that a man's condolences could be genuine, while he was simultaneously preparing to deliver a blow. He opened the folio. Willa looked at the paper he produced. She could see Thomas's handwriting at the bottom, the signature that she had seen on 100 documents over the years, the particular slant and pressure of it that she would have recognized in a crowd of 1,000 signatures. There it was, his name on a document she had never seen before. She kept her voice level. She asked, did Thomas know? Voss looked at her. Not at the cabin, not at the mountains, not at the folio. At her face. And she saw something in his expression that she had not expected, something that looked almost like its own private sorrow. He was a man with debts of his own in a city far from here. He had come not because he wanted to, but because the arithmetic of his own survival demanded it. This small piece of land, these fields, this timbered mountainside, they were not a home to him. They were a line item in a ledger that was bleeding red ink, and his desperation was the mirror image of hers, though his was armed with paper and law. He said he signed the note himself, ma'am. She had known before he answered. She had known from the moment she saw the signature. Thomas had borrowed against the land. He had done it after a poor harvest, a desperate gamble for seed money. The kind of decision that a man made in the middle of the night, when the fear of losing what he had built was greater than his ability to ask for help. He had hidden it from her the way men sometimes hid their shame, folding it into a private place where it would not have to be spoken, hoping that the next harvest would be good enough to erase it before anyone had to know. The next harvest had been good enough. He had been working toward the payment when the fever came. He had died with the secret still in him. Willa stood on the porch of the home he had built and held this knowledge inside her chest, where it pressed against her ribs with a force that had nothing to do with the clean grief of losing someone you loved, and everything to do with the complicated grief of discovering that the person you lost had been carrying something alone that they should have carried together. She was not angry at him. She did not have room yet for anger. She had only the overwhelming sadness of understanding that he had been afraid, that he had been so afraid of failing her, that he had made himself carry it alone, that the man who built this cabin with his own hands and filled it with 35 years of love had died without trusting her with one true and terrible fact. Voss gave her the terms. His voice was careful, and even not without sympathy, the voice of a man performing a necessary function that he would prefer not to be performing. She had until the first heavy snow to vacate the premises. After that, the property reverted to him as stipulated. He gestured to the mountains above them, the dark, serrated wall of the high peaks. No one would want to cross those passes once the snow flew. He suggested they be long gone before then. He left. The sound of his horse diminished down the lane and was replaced by the ordinary sounds of the mountain afternoon wind in the firs, the creek in its channel, a hawk somewhere high and out of sight. Willa stood on the porch. She stood there for what might have been 10 minutes or an hour. The light changed around her in the subtle way that September light changed in the mountains, the angle of it shifting toward afternoon. The shadows of the pines lengthening across the yard where Thomas had been cutting wood, when his body finally told him what it had been trying to tell him for a week. Behind her, through the door she had left open, she heard Ruth's voice. Ruth said, "Come in and eat something." Willa came in. The days that followed had the quality of water running under ice, moving purposefully in a place where movement was not supposed to be possible. She did not grieve in the way she had expected to grieve. She grieved while packing. She grieved while deciding what could be carried and what could not. She grieved in the practical language of the land, which was the only language she had ever fully trusted. The language of weight and distance and what a body could manage over difficult ground. She told Ruth on the second day. Ruth listened without changing her expression. The old woman had a face that had been schooled by 82 years of Montana life into something beyond reaction, into a kind of bedrock stillness that absorbed information without broadcasting it back. When Willa finished, Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The trail north." Willa said, "It is the only way through before the passes close." Ruth said nothing more. She went to her room and began to sort what she would carry. Silas Pruitt came to see them off on the morning they left. He arrived at first light with a small parcel of jerked meat pressed into Willa's hand, and an extra wool blanket that he tucked into Ruth's arms without ceremony. He looked at both of them with the expression of a man who had lived long enough to know when something was truly hopeless, and who could not quite make himself say so out loud. He said, "The trail north is madness in this weather. You will not make it 10 miles. Ruth said, "A choice between a quick death out there and a slow one in the town square. I will take the honest cold." Silas shook his head with the slow gravity of a man who had been right about too many things and taken no pleasure in any of them. He turned away. He could not watch them go. Willa did not watch the cabin as she walked away from it. She understood instinctively and completely that to look back was to invite a despair so large it would swallow the capacity for forward motion. The cabin was behind her. Thomas had built it. Thomas was gone. The mountain ahead required everything she had, and she did not have the surplus for goodbye. Before she left the porch for the last time, she had stood in the kitchen and made a decision she could not explain. Thomas had kept a prospecting pan on a shelf near the door, the one artifact of his searching years before they were married, the years he had spent moving through the high country with a bedroll and a pick, and the absolute conviction that the mountains held something worth finding. He had never found it. He had set down the pan and picked up a hammer and built a life instead. And the pan had sat on that shelf for 35 years, clean and useless, a relic of unfulfilled dreams. Willa had dusted around it. She had never moved it. She took it down from the shelf. She could not have told anyone why. The pan was heavy and awkward and made no practical sense among the supplies she was choosing with such rigorous economy. She had passed over things of greater utility, things that took up less space and weighed less. But her hands had taken the pan from the shelf and her body had folded it into the pack, and she had not argued with the decision because she had learned over 62 years to recognize the difference between instinct and impulse, and this was instinct. Whatever it meant, whatever it was reaching toward that she could not yet see. Jasper walked beside her. The dog had been Thomas's in the way that a working dog was a man's, not as a possession, but as a partnership, as a daily collaboration between two creatures whose intelligence took different forms and combined into something greater than either alone. Thomas and Jasper had covered this mountain country together for 7 years. Every trail, every creek crossing, every high meadow and stone field and dark passage through dense timber. The dog carried that geography in his body, the way Willa carried her grief as a thing that had become structural, a part of the architecture of who he was. Now Jasper walked beside Willa with his shoulder occasionally touching her leg, a pressure that was neither accidental nor sentimental but purposeful, the touch of a creature attending to a task. The first day was hard. The second day was harder. The mule, their last link to the world of sufficient supplies, gave up on the afternoon of the second day. It sank to its knees in a drift that had no business being as deep as it was on a section of trail that should not have had drifts at all, and it looked at Willa with eyes that held no accusation and no apology, only the simple animal fact of a body that had reached its limit. She took what she and Ruth could carry between them and left the rest. She did not cry. She did not have the water to spare. They pressed on because there was no alternative to pressing on. The sky was the color of old iron. The wind found every gap in their clothing, with the patient thoroughness of something that had been doing this work for 10,000 years and had not yet found a coat it could not eventually defeat. On the third night they found the overhang. It was a shallow thing, a horizontal shelf of granite barely sufficient to deflect the worst of the wind, offering the suggestion of shelter without its substance. Willa and Ruth pressed themselves against the rock behind it, and Willa pulled the blankets around both of them and tried to calculate what she had left to work with, which was very little. The fire she built was small and mean and consumed what fuel they could find from the sparse, snow-laden timber nearby within an hour. When it died, the cold came in the way it had been waiting to come. Ruth's breathing had changed. It had been changing since the second day, becoming shallower, less assured, the breathing of a body that was negotiating rather than simply functioning. Willa held her and tried to pour her own warmth into the old woman's frame, which was futile physics, but the only physics available. She knew what futile felt like. She knew the difference between useful action and the performance of action, because doing nothing was too terrible to consider. She performed it anyway. Jasper would not settle. He paced. He pressed his nose into Willa's hand with an insistence that escalated through the hours from suggestion to demand. His golden eyes found hers in the darkness with an expression that she recognized in the abstract as urgency, but could not yet translate into any specific instruction. He rose, turned toward the opening of the overhang, looked back at her, rose again, turned again. His body was speaking a language she had not yet learned, and she was aware of this gap in her understanding as a specific, acute frustration. Then he took the hem of her sleeve in his teeth, gently. Not an aggressive grip, but a deliberate one, the grip of a creature making a request it intended to make again and again until it was answered. He pulled. She resisted. He pulled again. Ruth said, her voice barely more than a thread of sound. In the dark, "He is just cold, girl." But Willa looked at the dog. She looked at him the way she had learned to look at things over 62 years, of living close to the land with the specific receptive attention that required you to set aside what you expected to see in order to see what was actually there. And what was there in Jasper's posture, in the set of his ears, in the forward angle of his body, and the fixed certainty of his gaze, was not the restlessness of a cold animal. It was not fear or confusion, or the generalized anxiety of a creature in a difficult situation. It was direction. Jasper knew where he was going. He had known for some time. He had been trying to tell her, and she had not been ready to hear it. And now he was trying again, with his teeth gentle on her sleeve, and his eyes steady on hers, and the blizzard pressing in from every direction. Willa looked at the fire that was no longer a fire. She looked at Ruth, who was still and cold beside her. still alive, but barely the tremor in her hand faint as a signal from a great distance. She looked at the overhang, which was not shelter enough, and would not become more shelter as the night continued. She looked at Jasper, and she understood that there were exactly two choices, and one of them ended here in this shallow place on this dark mountain, and the other required her to trust a dog in a blizzard in the direction of complete uncertainty. She understood that there was nothing brave about choosing uncertainty over certainty when the certain outcome was death. She understood that this was not courage, but mathematics, and that the mathematics had one answer, and that the answer was to stand up. She stood up. She wrapped Ruth in everything she had, and she put her arm around the old woman's shoulders, and she took a step out of the overhang and into the full force of the storm. And Jasper moved ahead of her immediately. His dark shape in the white darkness sure-footed and purposeful, moving along the base of a massive rock wall to the north, as if he had been here before, which of course he had, which of course Thomas had been here before him, which was something Willa would not understand until later. She could not see more than 5 feet in any direction. She could see Jasper. She followed him. The wind tore at them with a hatred that was not personal, but felt personal, pressing against their forward motion with a force that seemed to increase with each step, as if the mountain itself was testing whether they truly meant to keep going. Her legs burned. Her face went from painful cold to numb cold, to a cold that she stopped feeling, which was its own kind of alarm. She held Ruth against her side, and Ruth moved with a determination that was less walking than refusing to stop the last application of a will that had kept a body alive for 82 years through harder things than this. Jasper stopped. He stopped before a section of the cliff face that looked no different from the rest, a flat, featureless expanse of granite, and he turned to look at Willa with an expression that said, "Here." Then he dropped his nose to the base of the cliff and began to dig. His paws threw snow in arcs behind him, fast and urgent, and Willa dropped to her knees beside him, and her own hands found the snow and began to move it. Numb fingers clumsy against the packed weight of the drift, and she dug without knowing yet what she was digging toward. Only that Jasper knew, only that Thomas had known. Only that the pan on the shelf had meant something, even when it meant nothing. Only that the instinct that had put it in her pack was the same instinct that was telling her now to keep digging. Her fingers touched something. Not snow, not rock. A crack. A vertical line in the cliff face no wider than a man's shoulders. A fissure hidden by a slight outcropping that would have been completely invisible to anyone not specifically looking, and not visible even then. Not unless you were on your knees in the snow with a dog pressing against your shoulder. And from the crack came something that stopped her hands and stopped her breath and stopped the forward motion of her grief for one perfect suspended moment. Warmth. Not fire warmth. Not the warmth of another person, or of shelter improvised from imperfect materials. Something older than that. Something that came from deep in the earth, from a place where the mountain kept its temperature constant through every winter that had ever fallen on this land, steady and reliable as the movement of water underground. The breath of the stone itself exhaled through this narrow opening into the freezing air, where Willa knelt with her dead husband's panning dish in her pack, and her hands around a crack in the world. She turned to Ruth. Ruth's eyes were open. She was looking at the crack. She was feeling what Willa was feeling, the breath of a different temperature against her face, the suggestion of a world behind the wall. Willa said, "We go through." And they went through. The passage through the rock was a birth in reverse. Willa went first, turning sideways to fit her shoulders through the fissure, her pack scraping stone on both sides. the rock cold against her chest and her back simultaneously pressing her into the narrowest version of herself. For a moment, she was neither inside nor outside, neither in the world of the storm, nor in whatever world lay beyond, suspended in the mineral dark of the mountain's own body. Then the rock released her, and she was through. She reached back for Ruth. The old woman came through the gap, with her eyes closed and her face arranged into an expression of absolute concentration. The face of someone crossing a threshold they understand to be significant. Jasper came last, his body flowing through the crack with the liquid ease of an animal, built for exactly this kind of passage. A creature who had done this before, who knew this place, whose paws found the stone floor on the other side, with a sureness that was not luck. Then Willa heard the storm disappear, not diminish, not reduce to a manageable sound. Disappear. The fissure closed behind them, and the roaring that had been the entirety of the world for 3 days was severed, cut off, as completely as if someone had closed a door between 2 rooms. And the silence that replaced it was so absolute that Willa's ears rang with the absence of sound, a ringing that resolved slowly into something else, something rhythmic and deep and steady, a sound that was not silence at all, but a different kind of sound. Entirely. A sound that came from below and from within. She could not see anything. The darkness was not the darkness of a clouded night, which always held some residual light, some ambient glow from snow or stars. This was the darkness of the interior of Stone Ancient, and complete a darkness that predated every human eye that had ever tried to find something in it. Her hands found her pack. Her fingers, still half numb, worked at the buckles until she reached the tinderbox. She had practiced this in the dark of their cabin on winter nights, when Thomas teased her about her preparations, and the practice came back to her now, in her fingers rather than in her mind, the muscle memory of readiness. It took 4 attempts before the spark caught. The lantern flame was small. It trembled in the air currents of the space around them. And then, with the courage of something small that has decided to keep going, it steadied and grew, and the light it threw into the darkness began to show Willa what was there. She turned slowly. The cavern was enormous. Not large, the way a room was large, or the way a barn was large. Not the largeness that human beings constructed, and therefore understood intuitively. This was the largeness of a space that had been made by water and time and pressure over millions of years. A cathedral of stone whose ceiling rose into a darkness the lantern could not reach, whose walls curved away on all sides into the peripheral dark, in a way that suggested the chamber extended beyond what any single light source could reveal. The floor beneath her feet was mostly flat, worn smooth by water that had moved through here in some previous geological age, and then gradually retreated, leaving behind a surface as close to level as stone ever got, without human intervention. And then she heard it properly, for the first time. She had been hearing it since the moment they came through the fissure, but the shock of arrival had been too great for any single sense to fully claim her attention. Now she heard it as a distinct, continuous sound, a deep, resonant pulse that filled the chamber, the way a heartbeat filled a chest, present in everything, the frequency of the place itself. She lifted the lantern and turned. The waterfall was at the far end of the main chamber, and it was not a trickle or a seep or the modest movement of water through limestone that she might have expected in a cave of this kind. It was a proper fall, a column of water pouring from a cleft high in the cavern wall, visible in the lantern light, as a shimmering, moving curtain that plunged into a pool below with a sound that was simultaneously immense and intimate. a sound that filled the whole space without overwhelming it. Willa walked toward it. She walked because her legs moved before her mind made a decision, because the water was doing something to the air around it that her body recognized before her mind did. The mist from the waterfall hung in a fine perpetual cloud above the pool, and within that mist, the air temperature was measurably distinctly different from the frozen world outside. Not warm in the way of a fire, warm in the way of the earth itself, a warmth that came from deep below the surface where the stone held the heat of the planet's interior and released it slowly, steadily through the water that moved through these subterranean channels and carried that heat upward to the surface. The air that touched Willa's face at the edge of the pool was the air of a different season. She stood there for a long moment. She pressed her fingertips to the surface of the water and felt it not icy, not even particularly cold water that had come from somewhere deep and warm and had retained that warmth through its passage to this place. Then she cried, not the broken, ugly crying of grief, not the sudden releasing cry of unexpected good fortune, but the quiet, steady crying of a body that had held too much for too long and had finally found a place safe enough to put some of it down. The tears ran down her face without drama, without sound, and she did not wipe them, because she did not have the energy for the small vanity of wiping tears, and because there was no one to see them except Ruth and Jasper, and both of them had seen everything she had. Ruth had found a flat section of stone and lowered herself onto it. The old woman was pulling off her outermost layer, the heavy wool coat that had been Willa's before Willa outgrew it in her 40s, and she was wringing water from it with the methodical efficiency of someone performing a familiar task. The cave was warmer than outside, but it was not warm enough to justify removing layers. Willa understood this and then understood something more. Ruth had been moving in the ice-wet clothes for 3 days, and the cave was warm enough that wet clothes were now more dangerous than no clothes, and Ruth had made this calculation without being told. She was 82 years old. She had been surviving things since before Willa was born. Jasper had found a dry section of floor near the base of the cavern wall and lay down upon it with a precision that suggested he had chosen that specific spot deliberately, which, of course, he had. His tail moved once. His eyes found Willa's with an expression that was neither pride nor satisfaction, but something simpler and more complete than either. He had brought them here. Whatever happened next was up to them. Ruth spoke from her stone seat across the chamber. She said Thomas knew this place was here. It was not a question. The old woman had the specific authority of someone who had watched Thomas move through the mountains for years, who had understood the pattern of his movements and his silences in ways that even Willa had sometimes missed. Because she was too close to see the pattern, Ruth had known Thomas from the outside, from the perspective of an older woman watching a younger man carry something he could not quite put into words. He had been searching for something all those years before they married. Not something vague, not the romantic abstraction of the prospector who believed in mountains because he needed something larger than himself to believe in. Something specific. Something he had reasons to believe existed in this particular range, on this particular slope. He had made the search secondary to the life they were building, had folded it into occasional trips and weekends, and the private language of the pan on the shelf. But he had never entirely stopped. Willa looked down at her pack. Her hands knew what they were doing before her mind did, which was how the most important things in her life had always happened, by the hands knowing first. She opened the pack and reached past the practical things, past the food and the flint and the spare wool, until her fingers closed around the handle of the pan. Thomas's pan. She had carried it for 3 days without knowing why. She knew now, standing at the edge of a subterranean pool beneath a waterfall, in a cave that was warm when the world outside was trying to kill everything in it. She knew the way you knew something that your hands had understood long before your mind caught up. She took the pan to the water's edge. She crouched at the pool where the waterfall spray created its perpetual mist, and the water moved in slow, deep circles above whatever lay on the bottom. She scooped up a panful of silt and gravel from the shallows where the stone floor of the pool was accessible. The accumulated sediment of years of water moving through this place and depositing whatever it carried. She swirled the pan. She knew the motion. Thomas had shown her in the early years the patient tilting and circular movement that washed away the lighter material and concentrated the heavier. She had never been good at it. She had not the patience for the fine gradations of it. The difference between pyrite and real color. The ability to remain still enough and attentive enough for long enough to see what was actually in the pan, rather than what you hope was there. But what was in this pan did not require that kind of patience. The lighter gravel washed to the edge and over, and what remained was not the faint glimmer of a color that might be gold, or might be nothing. Not the tease of a trace that required a practiced eye to read. What remained was a broad, heavy smear of yellow that caught the lantern light and held it dense and unmistakable. And among the smear were several nuggets of varying sizes. The largest the size of her thumb. Irregular and heavy and exactly the color of something that did not need to explain itself. She held the pan for a moment without moving. Then she lifted the lantern and looked at the wall beside the pool. The section of rock that was constantly washed by the waterfall spray, and had been washed by it for centuries. What she had taken for the natural variation of stone in uncertain light resolved itself in the lantern's direct illumination into something that was not natural variation at all. The wall was threaded with gold, not veins precisely, not the thin lines that a prospector might trace with one finger. Thick ropes of it woven through the white quartz like frozen lightning running from the waterline upward, through the stone in branching patterns that multiplied the further up the wall she looked. The entire surface bordering the pool, the section that had been kept perpetually wet by the waterfall mist, was a lattice of pure yellow metal in the rock, a fortune in minerals pressed into the living stone of the mountain, waiting for exactly this light. Exactly this moment, exactly this particular woman who had carried a pan for 3 days, without knowing why. Willa stood up slowly. She carried the pan to Ruth and held it out. Ruth looked at it. She looked at it for a long time, with the specific attention of someone reading something they want to understand fully before they respond. She reached out and took the largest nugget between 2 fingers, and held it up to the lantern light, turning it. It was heavy. You could see the heaviness of it in the way it sat in her old fingers, in the way she adjusted her grip to account for its density. Ruth looked at the nugget. Then she looked at Willa. Then she looked around the vast, dark chamber, at their small fire that Willa had built while Ruth slept the first night. And that was now the center of this stone world at Jasper, by the wall at the waterfall that would not stop. She set the nugget down. She said, "It is pretty, but you cannot eat it. It will not keep you warm. It will not mend a broken heart. Here it is just yellow rock. Survival is the only treasure that matters right now." Willa looked at the pan in her hand, at the weight of what it contained at the wall, and its extraordinary secret. She understood Ruth. She understood the words and the wisdom behind them, and the long view of an 82-year-old woman who had watched enough people lose themselves to the fever that gold induced in certain temperaments. She understood that Ruth was right, and she understood that the gold was not their salvation. The cave was their salvation. The gold was what Thomas had been looking for. The unfulfilled dream made suddenly overwhelmingly real. But the dream was not what kept them alive. The water was warm, and the stone was solid, and the storm outside could not reach them. And those were the facts that mattered in the order that they mattered. She put the pan against the wall. She said, "You are right. Later we will think about what it means. For now we need a fire that will last the night. Ruth said there are dry timber remnants in the far passage. I walked it while you slept." Of course she had. The days that followed had the quality of a world establishing its own rules. The initial shock of the cavern faded into something more habitual, the awe becoming structural rather than overwhelming the way awe always became when you lived inside its object long enough. The cavern was their world now, and worlds required practical attention regardless of their magnificence. Willa became a creature of two territories. Inside the cavern building, tending the fire. Caring for Ruth, watching the waterfall for the information it carried, the slight changes in its volume and color that told her about conditions in the mountain above. She explored the chambers, plural, because the main cavern gave way to a series of passages and smaller spaces, most of them too tight or too dark for habitation, but some of them offering useful resources. Dry storage areas and flat surfaces in one long passage that curved north and eventually opened into a natural shaft that admitted light from above, too small for a person but large enough to show her the sky when the weather cleared and to let out the smoke of their fire. Outside necessity, between storms when the mountain relented briefly and the passes were traversable in the lower timber zones, Willa went out. She had found a stand of dead timber on the south-facing slope below the cave entrance. Seasoned pines that had been taken by beetles 2 summers ago and left standing dry and ready. She took the axe. She worked until her shoulders would not lift another stroke, then worked another 10 minutes after that. Because the woman who worked 10 minutes past her limit every day was a different woman than the one who stopped precisely at her limit. Getting the timber into the cave was the greater challenge. The logs, stripped of their branches and cut to manageable lengths, still required dragging up a slope that grew treacherous when the temperature dropped and iced the rock. She and Jasper worked together in the way that she had watched Jasper and Thomas work together on the farm, the dog understanding her intentions and moving to assist them with the specific intelligence of a creature who had spent years learning the difference between what a human needed and what a human asked for. The cabin began as an idea she turned over in her mind during the quiet hours when Ruth slept, and the waterfall maintained its steady conversation, and Jasper lay at her feet, with his gray-flecked muzzle resting on his paws. She had watched Thomas build. She had not just watched, but absorbed in the way a person who loved someone absorbed what that person loved. Taking in the vocabulary of timber and joinery over 35 years of breakfast conversations and Saturday afternoons, and the particular pleasure Thomas took in explaining a thing he understood completely to someone who was genuinely interested. She understood now that she had been genuinely interested, that she had not merely endured his explanations, but had kept them, had filed them somewhere in the architecture of herself, where they waited dormant for a moment of need. She selected a level area of the cavern floor far enough from the waterfall to avoid the perpetual mist, but close enough to benefit from the warmth the waterfall generated in the surrounding air. She set 4 cornerstones. She laid her first course of logs, and the notching was imperfect. The gaps uneven, the angles not quite true. She packed the gaps with a mixture of clay and moss from the damp corners of the cave and moved to the second course. It was slower than she expected, and harder than she expected, and more consuming than she expected. which was to say it was exactly what she should have expected from any project worth doing. And the slowness and the hardness were not arguments against continuing, but information about the scale of the undertaking and the patience it required. Ruth sat by the fire and watched and said little. Occasionally she said that notch is too shallow, or the moss needs more clay in it, or it will shrink when it dries. Her interventions were precise and infrequent, and she delivered them in the tone of a woman sharing information, rather than directing an inferior. And Willa accepted them in the same spirit. This was not a relationship of teacher and student. It was two women applying different kinds of knowledge to a shared problem. The work changed Willa. She could feel it happening the way she had felt seasons change as a girl gradually. And then all at once the shift between states that seemed gradual, until suddenly you realized you were fully in the new one. The woman who had stood on the porch watching Voss ride away with her shoulders held in a particular configuration of controlled despair was being replaced by something else. Someone harder in the fiber. Someone who had discovered through the daily application of a body to a difficult task that the limits she had believed in were mostly provisional. She was 62 years old. She was building a house inside a mountain. These two facts coexisted in her without contradiction, which itself was something new. One evening, with the cabin standing at 4 courses and the third wall begun, and the shape of the finished thing emerging from its approximation, she found herself at the pool's edge, with the lantern alone for the first time in several days, Ruth sleeping behind her in the warmth of the fire, and Jasper a warm weight against her hip. She sat cross-legged on the smooth stone and looked at the water, and let herself be still for a while. She had been avoiding this, not the stillness specifically, but what the stillness admitted. She had kept herself moving because moving was how she had managed since September, since the morning she found Thomas in the yard. The management of grief through motion through the next task and the one after was not avoidance exactly. It was a kind of respect, a recognition that some griefs could not be processed at full strength without a cost in function that she could not currently afford. But here, with the cabin taking shape behind her, and the immediate crisis of survival, having receded from emergency to ongoing project, the stillness was possible. And in the stillness, the grief was there exactly as she had known it would be, not smaller for having waited, but not larger either. The same size it had always been, the size of a life shared with someone for 35 years, which was a very considerable size. Thomas. She said his name in her mind and felt it move through her. She thought about his face, not the face of his last days, but the face she had known in all its variations through all the seasons of their life together. The face at breakfast and the face at the end of a hard day's work, and the face when he laughed, which was often, and the face when he was thinking about something deeply, which was the face she had loved most. The face he wore when he was fully occupied by a problem and had forgotten to be anything except the mind working on it. She was angry. The anger had been waiting alongside the grief all along, patient and justified. And here in the stillness it came forward. She was angry at him for keeping the debt from her. She was angry at him for the calculation he had made, the decision that his shame was more important than her ability to prepare, more important than her right to know the shape of the thing they were living inside. She was angry at him for trusting her with 35 years of his life, and not trusting her with one hard fact about one bad season. She let the anger be what it was without diminishing it or defending him against it, because it was real and it had been earned, and she owed it to herself to feel it fully. And then she looked at the pan she had set against the wall that first night and had not moved since. She looked at the wall beside the pool with its extraordinary cargo of yellow metal that Thomas had been searching for through the years before their marriage, through the long surveying trips he took every summer, through the particular attention he paid to this specific range of mountains, the way he had always known the high country here better than anywhere else, the way he had moved through it with a familiarity that she had attributed to experience, and that she now understood was something more specific. He had been here, not to this cavern, perhaps not precisely here, but he had known this side of the mountain the way you knew a thing you were looking for with the texture of dedicated attention. He had known the gold was somewhere in these rocks. He had not found the exact location. He had died without finding it, had set down the pan and picked up the hammer and built a life. And the life had been good, had been genuinely and substantially good. But the knowing had stayed in him all those years. The unfinished search folded into a relic on a shelf, and Jasper had known the trails, and Willa had taken the pan. She sat with this for a long time. She sat with the understanding that Thomas had not sent her here, that the dead did not arrange things, that coincidence was not intention, and survival was not a gift from the gone. She sat with the harder and more honest truth, which was that the pan on the shelf and the dog's knowledge of the trails in the particular direction Jasper had taken in the storm were each individually explicable without recourse to anything supernatural, and that the combination of them had nonetheless brought her to exactly the place she needed to be. She did not know what to call that. She knew what she felt, which was something she could only describe as the presence of Thomas in the accumulated consequence of his life in the artifact he had kept, and the animal he had trained, and the mountains he had loved enough to learn their secrets, all of it flowing forward through time, and arriving here in this particular form, at this particular moment in the hands of the woman who had loved him. She had been angry. She was still angry. The anger did not dissolve in the understanding, but it was joined now by something else, something that sat alongside the anger and did not cancel it, but complicated it. Something that was not forgiveness exactly. That word was too clean and too final for what she felt, but was perhaps the beginning of the territory that forgiveness eventually occupied, when it had been properly earned through grief. She picked up the pan. She held it in her hands, the weight of it, the particular balance of it, the worn smoothness of the handle where Thomas's hands had held it through all those years of searching. She felt the weight of what it had carried, and what it had found, and what it had not found. The whole long arc of a man's dream compressed into a simple tool. She said quietly and without prayer, without performance, only because the words needed to be said aloud to have their full weight, Thomas. I know you were afraid. I know you thought if I knew I would think less of you. I need you to understand that you were wrong. You were wrong to keep it, and I needed you not to keep it. And I am going to carry that anger for a while, because I am allowed to. But I am here, in the mountain you spent your life looking toward, with your pan and your dog. And the thing you could not find, we found it together. 35 years after the beginning and 3 months after the end. The waterfall continued its steady conversation. Jasper pressed his warm side against her leg. She sat there for a long time, and when she came back to the fire, she felt different, in a way that she could not precisely articulate, a small but perceptible shift in the weight she was carrying, as if some portion of it had been set down in the dark by the water and would not need to be picked up again. The cabin took shape through the weeks that followed. She learned to use the cave's specific qualities to her advantage, the constant temperature that made the clay dry slowly and cure evenly the natural drafts that carried smoke away from the living space and up through the passages that led to the shaft above. The structure grew to a single room with a sleeping loft she built by laying poles across two high beams, and she fitted it with a ladder that would have made Thomas smile, the joints cut slightly crooked. The rungs not quite evenly spaced, functional and imperfect, and thoroughly hers. She built a door. The door was the thing that mattered somehow beyond the practicality of it. It had hinges fashioned from bent metal, salvaged from the pack they had brought. It had a latch. It was a door that opened and closed upon a space that belonged to them. When she hung it and let it swing on its hinges for the first time, testing the movement, listening to the slight creak of metal against wood, she felt something that she could not name precisely, but that she recognized as related to the feeling Thomas must have felt when he fitted the last log into the cabin. At the foot of the valley, the feeling of a completed thing, a sheltered place, a door between what was inside and what was not. Ruth watched the door swing. She said it sticks on the left side. Willa said, I know. I will plane it. Ruth said, or you could leave it. A door that requires a specific motion to open is not a thing that strangers operate easily. Willa looked at the door. She thought about that. She did not plane it. Outside, the winter pressed on. The storms came in their regular progression, each one announcing itself with a particular quality of light change that Willa was learning to read the sky above the shaft, darkening in a specific way, before a major storm brightening to an almost painful white, before a brief thaw. She noted these patterns in the small notebook she had thought to bring in the margins around Thomas's old entries about mineral deposits and trail conditions, her observations layering themselves over his in a geological record of 2 lives and 1 mountain. The winter was long. It was long in the way that all necessary things were. Long in a way that was not wasted time, but deposited time each day, adding something to what she knew, and what she could do, and who she was becoming in this stone world, with its eternal waterfall and its impossible warmth. The gold in the walls said nothing. It simply was present and patient, worth beyond calculation, and yet, as Ruth had said, incapable of doing any of the actual work of survival. That work was Willa's. She did it. She did it every day, and every day it made her more capable of doing it, which was the mathematics of survival. The compounding interest of effort applied consistently in the right direction. Jasper's muzzle grew a little grayer with each passing week. His golden eyes remained steady, watching her, accompanying her, the faithful and unremarked presence of a creature who had completed his most important task and was now simply doing what he had always done, which was to stay close to the people he had chosen. The winter wore toward its end, and somewhere in the world below the mountain, a man with a leather folio was planning to come looking for what he thought was his. The thaw came in January, the way thaws always came in the high country. Briefly and without sincerity, a week of relative warmth that was less a softening of winter than a pause in it, winter catching its breath before the next assault. The shaft above showed a circle of pale blue sky for 3 days running. The temperature inside the cavern did not change, but Willa could feel the change outside through some instinct she had developed over decades of living close to the mountain. A barometric shift in the air itself. A loosening. She was outside on the 4th day of the thaw, working the timber stand below the cave entrance, when Jasper stopped. He did not growl. He did not bark. He simply stopped moving and became completely still, which was more alarming than any sound he could have made. Because Willa had learned in the months of living closely with him that Jasper expressed degrees of alertness through graduated levels of stillness. And this stillness was the deepest register. The stillness of a creature that had identified something specific, and was calculating its response with the full application of every sense it possessed. She stopped too. She held the axe and did not move and looked in the direction Jasper was looking, which was down the slope toward the lower timber and the trail that connected these mountains to the valley below. She heard it then, the sound of a horse on frozen ground, the particular strike of shod hooves on ice-covered stone, unhurried and deliberate, the sound of a horse being ridden by a man who was looking at the terrain rather than moving through it quickly, the sound of someone searching. Willa did not hesitate. She touched Jasper's shoulder once, a light pressure that meant, "Come," and she moved back up the slope toward the cave entrance with the axe in her hand, not running but moving fast, and with purpose the way she moved when weather was coming in, and there was work to finish before it arrived. Jasper moved beside her without sound. They went through the crack in the rock, and Willa pulled the accumulated snow back across the base of the fissure as best she could, filling in the area they had disturbed, restoring the appearance of undisturbed drift. Then she pressed herself against the interior wall and waited. Ruth was awake. The old woman had the specific alertness of someone who did not require explanation, who read the quality of Willa's entrance and understood its meaning without words. She set down the book she had been reading and sat upright and was still. Willa put her finger to her lips. Ruth nodded once. Jasper lay down against the interior wall below the line of any light that might enter through the crack. He was not tense. He was controlled, which was different from not tense, the deliberate regulation of a trained animal, holding itself in the precise state of alertness that its person required. He breathed through his nose silently. His golden eyes tracked the fissure and did not leave it. The sound of the horse grew louder. Then it plateaued, which meant the rider was close within the range of the lower cliff face. Willa could hear very faintly the sound of the horse's breath in the cold air, the occasional small sound of a hoof shifting on stone. The rider had stopped. He was examining something. She pressed herself harder against the rock and did not breathe. Through the narrow gap in the fissure, which was itself invisible from outside, unless you were specifically looking for it and knew what you were looking for, a thin slice of the exterior world was visible to her. She could see a fragment of slope, a section of sky, the edge of the rock wall. And then slowly from the left, a figure moved into this narrow frame of vision. Harlan Voss. He was 50 feet away, perhaps less. He had dismounted and was standing at the base of the cliff face, with his hands in his coat pockets and his head turned slightly, scanning the wall with the systematic attention of a man performing a search. He was dressed for the cold in a way that spoke of preparation rather than experience, the right coat and the right boots, but worn with the slight stiffness of someone who had bought the equipment rather than worn it into its proper shape. He was a city man in the mountains, and the mountains were not explaining themselves to him. She could see his face when he turned it in the direction of the fissure. He looked directly at it. He was at most 40 feet away. She was looking at him through a crack that she could have spanned with both hands. The gap was there in the cliff face, precisely where he was looking, and she could see every feature of his face clearly enough to read the frustration in it. The cold, reddened skin of his cheeks, the set of his jaw. He looked at the rock. He saw rock. This was the thing about Harlan Voss that Willa understood for the first time as she watched him standing not 40 feet from the entrance to her world, looking directly at the place she lived and seeing nothing. He was a man who had developed his vision in offices and courtrooms and the interiors of buildings where the significant things were human-made and human-scaled and clearly delineated, where important things had edges and labels. He had no language for the kind of significance that was hidden in geological accident, in the particular way a ledge of rock threw shadow at a certain angle, in the way a crack could be invisible not because it was well hidden, but because it was not the kind of thing a certain kind of eye had been trained to see. He kicked at a snowdrift at the base of the cliff. The kick was the gesture of a man expressing frustration at an inanimate object that was failing to cooperate with his intentions. A small rock dislodged from the upper edge of the drift and skittered down the slope, the sound of it sharp and brief in the immense quiet of the high country after snow. He stood there for another long moment. Then he looked north. Willa could not see what he was seeing, but she knew what was there, because she had been watching the sky through the shaft for a week. And she had seen the change coming, the darkening of the clouds over the north ridge. That meant the thaw was ending and the next serious storm was already on its way down from the high passes. In a few hours, the sky that was currently pale and tentatively clear would be that dense particular gray that preceded serious snowfall. And in a few hours more, the world would be white again and impassable. Voss read this correctly, if nothing else. He turned. He walked back to his horse, which was standing on a flat section of rock below the cliff, with the resigned patience of an animal that had been in bad situations before and had made its peace with the category. He mounted. He sat for a moment looking back up at the cliff face with an expression that Willa, watching through the gap, recognized as the expression of a man who would tell himself a specific story about this outcome. A story in which he had done what could be done, and the mountain had been uncooperative, a story that would allow him to close the chapter without acknowledging what the chapter actually contained. He turned the horse and rode down the slope. The sound of hoofbeats diminished, faded, was replaced by wind and the distant conversation of the waterfall, which had been continuing its steady commentary through all of this, indifferent as only geological processes could be, to the small, urgent dramas of human beings playing out near them. Willa let out a breath. She realized she was shaking, not with fear. The fear had not fully arrived until now, which was how fear often worked, arriving after the danger had passed, as if to make up for the time it had missed. Her hands on the axe handle were trembling slightly with the particular tremor of a body that had held itself in extreme tension for an extended period and was now releasing it. She sat down on the cave floor. Jasper was at her side, immediately pressing the full length of his body against her leg, sharing his warmth with a deliberateness that was entirely intentional. Ruth said, "He is gone." Willa said, "He is gone." Ruth said, "He will say they are dead." It is easier for him to say they are dead. Willa looked at the gap in the rock through which Harlan Voss had been visible, 40 feet away, looking at the wall that hid everything. She thought about what Ruth had just said. She thought about the ledger in Denver, the red ink that Voss had come all the way up a Montana mountain in January to address. She thought about him, riding back down the slope in the last light of a thaw that was ending, going back to the valley, going back to the town, eventually, going back to the city that was his actual habitat. The city of straight lines and clear titles where the mountains were a concept rather than a presence. She thought about the story he would tell. He would tell it the way people told stories about things that had gone wrong, when the wrong could not be fixed with the particular grammar of forces beyond human control, with the mountain as the agent and himself as the witness. The widow and her mother-in-law had gone up into the high country in October, ahead of an early blizzard. No one had seen them since. The mountain had done what mountains did. It was a tragedy, and tragedies had to be absorbed and moved past, because there was no other way to continue. He would not come back. Not this winter, and not with the same conviction in the spring, because the story he told would become real to him in the way that stories became real when you told them enough times, when the telling replaced the event itself in your memory, with its own cleaner, more manageable version. He would believe eventually, and perhaps genuinely, that Willa Hale was dead. She sat with this for a moment. The shaking had mostly stopped. The fear was settling into something else, something flatter and more permanent. Not relief exactly, because relief implied that the threat was over, and she understood that no threat was ever entirely over, only managed and managed again as conditions changed. But something close to relief. And beside it, unexpectedly and with a quietness that surprised her, something that she could only describe as sadness. She had not expected to feel sad about Voss's departure. She had expected to feel only the absence of fear, the removal of a threat, the clean, simple good of a danger that had passed. Instead, she felt something more complicated, something that arrived without her permission and refused to be dismissed as inappropriate. She thought about Ruth's voice on the first day when Voss had ridden away from the cabin, after delivering his terms, a choice between a quick death out there and a slow one in the town square. The words had been about her own situation, her own necessity. But in the weeks since living in the mountain with her fire, and her waterfall and the cabin she was building with her own hands, Willa had turned those words over and found another meaning in them. The choice between one kind of death and another was not a choice that belonged only to women who had been put out of their homes by the law. It was a choice that Voss was also making in his office in Denver, among his ledgers and his creditors, with his own specific necessity pressing on him from all sides. He had come up the mountain because he was also running from a slow death. His desperation and hers were made of different materials but were the same shape. She had the mountain. He had the law. She had found what she needed. He had found granite. The sadness was for him, she realized. Not forgiveness, not yet, not the full-formed thing that the word implied, but the recognition of another human being in difficulty, and the particular sadness that came from understanding that the world required some people to be harmed by the solutions of others, and that Voss was not a villain from a story but a man in trouble who had aimed his trouble at her and missed, and that the missing was not a moral victory, but simply a fact of geography and a dog who knew the mountain. Ruth said, "What are you thinking about?" Willa said, "Voss." Ruth said, "Some men are not meant for the high places." She said it quietly, with the tone she used for observations rather than judgments. The tone of a woman who had watched enough of life to have arrived at certain conclusions about how the world sorted people, not by their virtue or their ambition, but by some more fundamental quality of compatibility with what particular places required. The high places required a specific kind of attention, a willingness to be a small thing in the presence of large things, a capacity for patience in the face of indifference. Some people had it. Some people did not. Voss did not. The mountain had looked at him and found nothing to work with. Willa had come up this mountain in desperation, and the mountain had found something to work with. She did not know what to call what that meant. She was not a woman who had ever relied much on the language of fate or providence. She believed in effort and preparation and the specific knowledge that came from paying attention. She believed in a dog who had spent 7 years learning the trails of this mountain and who had not forgotten them. She believed in a pan that a man had kept on a shelf for 35 years, and a woman who had taken it down without knowing why. She believed in what was actually in front of her, which was the inside of a mountain, warm and stable, and full of more gold than she would ever need, and an old woman reading by firelight, and a gray-muzzled dog asleep against her hip. The winter finished its work and gave way, The thaw that followed the January scare was false, but the March thaw was real. The kind that came with the smell of something underneath the snow that was not yet identifiable as a specific growing thing, but was unmistakably alive. The molecular announcement of a season that had been waiting underground and was now beginning to push upward. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes, first exposing the matted brown grass and the dark soil beneath, and the creak sounds that had been muffled under ice for months became suddenly audible again, the water finding its voice as it found its movement. Willa began to plan, not in the anxious, reactive way she had planned in October, the planning of someone managing an emergency, but in the deliberate, forward-looking way of a person whose immediate survival was no longer in question, and who could therefore attend to the longer horizon. She thought about what they needed. She thought about the season ahead, and the one after that, and the shape of a life that could be maintained in this place, a life that was neither reckless nor craven, that was hidden without being paralyzed, that used what the mountain offered without destroying what the mountain kept. The gold. She thought about the gold with the same practical attention she brought to the timber, and the food, and the water. Ruth had been right about the immediate question, the question of survival in the acute sense. But Ruth had not said the gold was worthless. She had said it was not the first treasure, which was a different and more precise thing. The first treasure was life. The second treasure was what life could become once it was secured. Willa understood this distinction in the way she understood most important things, by having lived through the version where it wasn't understood. She had watched in the years before the mountain how quickly the desire for security could shade into the desire for accumulation, how men could lose the essential thing while chasing the instrumental one, could spend their best years acquiring the means of living without ever attending to the life itself. Thomas had understood this, she thought now. He had put down the pan. He had picked up the hammer. He had built a life, and the life had been worth building. And the gold had sat in the wall of the mountain for all those years, like a patient fact, waiting to be needed rather than merely wanted. She would use it as Thomas had used it, as a means rather than an end, as a way to maintain what they had, to protect it, to add to it quietly and without spectacle. Once a season, when the passes were clear and the trading post in the next valley was reachable, she would make the trip. She took the long route, the one that bypassed the main valley entirely, that came down through the north-facing timber, and joined the back trail to a settlement 2 days' ride from the land that had been hers and Thomas's, and was now legally Voss's, for whatever legal meant, in a place where Voss had not returned and was not likely to. The first trip she made alone. Ruth had looked at her from the doorway of the cabin they had built together inside the mountain and said, "Take the smaller nuggets. No one needs to wonder about large ones." She said, "Come back before dark on the third day." And Willa had done both of these things, moving through the spring mountains with the sureness of someone who had earned her footing in this country, through a winter's worth of daily movement, trading 2 small nuggets for flour and salt and sugar and coffee, and 6 books that she chose carefully from the small selection in the trader's back room books for Ruth, whose hunger for the printed word was the most consistent thing about her. The trader was a taciturn woman of 50 who asked no questions about where the gold came from. In this country, during this period, in a trading post that operated on the margins of established settlements, questions about the origins of gold were questions that nobody asked, because everybody understood that the range of honest answers was limited, and the range of dishonest ones was vast, and distinguishing between them was both impossible and unprofitable. Willa paid for what she needed. She thanked the woman. She left. No one followed her. No one knew her name, and she had not offered it. The second year moved more easily than the first. Willa extended the cabin, adding a second room for Ruth that gave the old woman privacy and the comfort of a dedicated space for her books and her thinking. She built a better storage system in the dry alcove at the back of the cavern, with shelves that kept their supplies off the damp floor and organized in the way that made sense to the specific rhythms of their life. The things used daily in front, the things used seasonally behind. Ruth taught her things. This surprised Willa, who had thought of Ruth primarily as a presence to be cared for, a beloved and formidable old woman whose wisdom was aphoristic rather than practical. What she discovered in the second year, when survival had stabilized enough to allow attention to the texture of daily life, was that Ruth had accumulated over 82 years a quantity of practical knowledge that was so deeply embedded in her ordinary behavior that it was nearly invisible. She knew how to preserve food by methods that required no equipment that the mountain could not supply. She knew the medicinal properties of plants that grew in the mountain meadows above the cave, and she taught Willa to collect them in summer, when the passes opened and the slopes were accessible. She knew how to read weather in ways that the shaft admitted to the cave above them. The angle of light and the quality of the cold and the specific color of the sky through that small opening that told her more about the coming days than any almanac. She had been using this knowledge her entire life, without calling it knowledge the way people used their most essential capacities as the invisible structure of ordinary function, rather than as a skill they possessed. Willa wrote it down in the notebook that had belonged to Thomas, in the margins of his entries, and on the blank pages at the back, and eventually in a second notebook she bought at the trading post. She wrote what Ruth taught her and what she herself discovered, and the observations she made about the cave and the mountain across the seasons. She wrote the temperature of the pool at different times of year, and the volume of the waterfall in different weather conditions, and the specific plants that appeared at specific elevations in specific weeks of the summer. She wrote it all down in the same spirit that her father had kept his own records, not knowing precisely who would read them, or when, only knowing that careful records were a form of respect for the truth, a way of holding what you had learned, so that it did not die with you. Jasper grew older. His muzzle was fully white by the end of the second year, and he had developed the measured, deliberate movement of a dog who had decided to spend his energy carefully, who rested with intention and rose with intention, and allocated his considerable intelligence to the things that actually required it. He was still watchful. He still rose and went to the fissure entrance when anything outside changed in a way that required assessment. His golden eyes still found Willa's with the steady ancient intelligence that she had come to think of as his truest and most consistent quality, the thing that had been there from the first day she had known him, and that she suspected would be there until he was gone. She tried not to think about him being gone. She thought about it anyway in the quiet hours, because this was what it meant to love a creature that would not outlive you a thing. Willa had always understood abstractly, and now understood in the way that proximity made abstract things concrete. She thought about it and held the grief of the future in the present, the way you held a lamp in a dark room, not to illuminate the darkness, but to know it was there to maintain the awareness that the darkness was real, and that the light was real, and that both were true simultaneously. One evening in the second autumn, when the shaft above was showing a sky the color of bronze, and the first cold of the new season was making itself known through the subtle shift in the cave's air, Willa sat at the edge of the pool with the lantern and looked at the wall. She did not look at it the way she had looked at it the first night, with the shock of a person encountering something impossible. She looked at it the way she looked at the grain in the cabin's wooden walls, with the comfortable familiarity of a thing that was simply part of the environment she lived inside. The gold was there. It had always been there. It would be there long after she was gone, which was a thought that settled around her. Not with the chill she might have expected, but with a kind of warmth, the warmth of something permanent and reliable, in a world that had demonstrated its unreliability in such comprehensive ways. Ruth came and sat beside her. The old woman lowered herself to the stone with the careful economy of someone who had learned to work with what a body in its 9th decade could offer, and to be neither impatient with its limitations nor indifferent to its capacities. She looked at the wall, too. She looked at the waterfall. She looked at the light dancing on the surface of the pool, where the lantern's reflection intersected with the waterfall's movement. Ruth said, "Do you miss it?" The cabin. Willa thought about this honestly. She thought about the cabin at the foot of the valley, the one Thomas had built log by log with his own hands, the one where they had lived for 35 years and raised their life together. She thought about the kitchen where she had made breakfast every morning of those years, about the porch he had rebuilt the summer before he died, about the particular quality of morning light through the east-facing window that she had loved and taken for granted and would never see again. She said, "I miss Thomas in it." Ruth said, "That is different from missing the place." Willa said, "Yes." She thought about it some more. She thought about whether she missed the world. The cabin represented the world of neighbors and seasons marked by community events, and the ordinary social fabric of a valley where people knew each other's names and histories, the world of the town, and the trading post, and the almanac and the road that connected her to everything else. She thought about whether the hidden life, the life conducted in secret inside the mountain, was a deprivation or something else. She said, "I do not miss being at the mercy of other people's arithmetic." Ruth made a sound that was as close to a laugh as she usually allowed herself. She said, "That is a good answer." They sat together for a while in the way they had learned to sit together over 2 years of daily proximity, not needing to fill the silence, because the silence itself was a form of company, the waterfall providing everything a silence needed to be comfortable, rather than empty. Then Ruth said, "What do you think he did?" "Voss." Willa said, "I think he went back to Denver. I think he told everyone we were gone. I think the land sat empty for a while, and then he sold it or tried to, or he defaulted on his own debts, and someone else took the land, and eventually someone else is farming that valley. And they have no idea any of this exists," Ruth said. "And if someone comes looking?" Willa said, "No one is coming looking, Ruth." Ruth said, "But if they did?" Willa looked at the fissure in the rock, the narrow vertical gap that was her door, the entrance to everything they had built. She thought about what it would take to find it. She thought about the generations that would have to pass before this country was settled densely enough that someone might be climbing this specific cliff face looking for something and might find the crack in the rock and might, knowing what to look for, squeeze through it. She said, "If someone comes looking in the way that someone might come looking, they will probably be someone who deserves what they find." Ruth considered this. She said, "That is also a good answer." The 3rd autumn came. The 2nd autumn had been good, and the 3rd was better. Not because their circumstances had materially changed, but because they had settled into themselves, into the life they were building here, into the specific satisfactions and specific difficulties of it, in the way that any life settled when you gave it enough time and enough honest attention. The cabin was warm. The stores were full. Willa had mapped the cave's passages well enough to move through them without the lantern in the sections she traveled regularly. Ruth had finished 3 of the books from the last trading trip and had asked with the specificity of someone who had thought carefully about the request for a particular title that she believed the traitor might have, if Willa described it precisely. Jasper slept more. He was still himself, still watchful, still present in the way that mattered. But the sleep had lengthened and deepened, and Willa watched it the way you watch something you could not stop, with the full attention of someone who understood that attention was the only tribute available when tribute was called for. One evening she was standing at the edge of the pool, and Jasper came and stood beside her, which was what he always did when she was there, pressing his shoulder against her leg. She looked down at him. He looked up at her. The golden eyes were the same as they had always been, the same eyes that had found hers in the lean-to on that last night, the same eyes that had said, "Trust me." She thought about Thomas. She thought about the shape of the life she was living, its remoteness and its richness and its complete difference from anything she had planned or expected. She thought about the cabin at the foot of the valley, and the cabin inside the mountain, and the distance between them measured not in miles, but in what she had become in the crossing. She thought about 62 years of accumulation, the layering of experience and loss and love and hard work that had brought her to this specific place, this cave, this water, this light, this dog. She thought about what a home was. She had thought she knew. She had thought she knew from the 35 years she had lived inside one, from the way she had felt in the cabin's kitchen on any ordinary morning, the particular safety of a place that was yours and that held you. She had thought home was a specific building in a specific valley built by a specific man who was no longer alive, and that the loss of it was the loss of home itself. She understood now that the building had been a form, and the home had been what she and Thomas made inside it, which was not a thing you could take from a person with a leather folio and a politely delivered deadline. It was a thing you carried with you in your hands, and in your decisions, and in the way you built and rebuilt and kept building in whatever space you found yourself, because the building was the home and not the structure. This cave was home, not because it was comfortable, though. The second year's work had made it genuinely comfortable. Not because it was safe, though. Its hiddenness made it safer than anything she had known. It was home because she had built it with her own hands and filled it with her own choices, and lived in it through the whole range of what living involved: the grief and the fear, and the daily labor, and the quiet evenings and the conversations with Ruth, and the presence of Jasper, and the sound of the waterfall that she would hear in her dreams for the rest of her life. She was 64 years old. She was standing beside an underground lake inside a mountain in Montana with a gray-muzzled German shepherd pressing his warm weight against her leg. She had started with nothing, and she had built something. Not from gold, which was still in the wall where it had always been patient and indifferent. The mountain's private secret shared now with two women who knew better than to let it change who they were, from the harder and more necessary materials, from grief and stubbornness and the knowledge in her hands, and the wisdom of an old woman who knew that some choices were obvious when you stripped away everything that obscured them, from a dog who had known the mountain the way his person had known the mountain, and who had trusted her to follow when she had no logical reason to follow and had been right, from a pan that had sat on a shelf for 35 years waiting to be understood, from a crack in a cliff face that was invisible until it was not. She placed her hand on the rock wall beside her, not the gold-threaded section near the pool, but the ordinary wall, the plain granite of the mountain itself, cold and absolute and entirely indifferent to her presence or her history or her opinion of it. She could feel the slight vibration of the waterfall transmitted through the stone, the mountain's heartbeat steady and enormously patient, the rhythm of something that had been here before she was born, and would be here after every trace of her existence had dissolved back into the earth from which it came. She stood there for a while, just stood with her hand on the stone, feeling the mountain's indifference and finding it unexpectedly one of the most comforting things she had ever felt. It did not care about her. It did not require her to be anything or to have achieved anything or to have justified her presence in its company. It simply was. And she simply was. And the simplicity of that, the cleanness of two things existing simultaneously, without one requiring the other to explain itself, was something she would have found terrifying at 40 and found at 64 the nearest thing to peace she had ever known. Jasper leaned harder against her leg. Ruth's voice came from the cabin door, unhurried and warm. "The fire needs feeding." Willa took her hand from the wall. She looked at the waterfall one more time, the way she looked at it every evening, not to memorize it because it was already memorized, but simply because looking at it was one of the daily pleasures of her life. The light moving in it and the sound of it and the fact of it. This improbable, irreplaceable, eternal thing that had been here waiting in the dark before she came and would be here long after she was gone. She said to Jasper, "Come on then." And they went inside together into the warmth and the light, into the home they had made in the only place where they had ever been entirely safe, into the life that no ledger could record, and no folio could contain, and no man on a well-fed horse would ever be able to find. Because the mountain kept its secrets, and they had become one of them. The door closed behind them. The waterfall continued. The gold in the wall said nothing. It simply was, and that was enough.